We're going to be building the skill of practicing biblical poetry. The system for reading biblical poetry: 1, we recognize a poem. 2, we read the poem. 3, we explore the poem. And then 4, we leave with a what. So recognize, read, explore, and leave with a what. So what are the mechanics? So the mechanics of biblical poetry is, first, how do we recognize a poem in the Bible? So if 1/3 of the Bible is poetry, why is it that I've been reading for way too long in my life as if it's not poetry? Well, part of it is because I don't recognize or see the poems. When it comes to biblical poetry, there are about, let's see, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Lamentation. All of these are basically called poetry books. That means the majority of what's written in this is poetry. And I was amazed when I realized that most of Job is poetry, because I've been reading it like it was a story the entire time. Yeah. But not only that, the prophetic books, you could probably say that anywhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of the major and minor prophets, that those are written in poetry. Again, this is why some of the frustration behind reading some of these books. Imagine reading a poem like it's an essay and being like, this makes no sense. Same thing right here. If we say, okay, this is a poem that the author is communicating in, maybe that'll make it a little bit easier. So recognize, as soon as you come across one of these books, your ears should go up. Okay, a poem is here. I'm about to engage a poem. Not only that, pay attention to indentations and spacing. You'll see, as we go on, that indentation and spacing clue you in that there's a poem. We're going to look at a chapter, and we're just going to see where the poetry lay. So if you have a Bible, make sure you go to that. When you look at Genesis 16, we're in Genesis 16, everyone. Where do you see the indentations we talked about for a poem? And so if you just look at it, review it, between which verses?
Between 11 and 13. So verses, 11 and 12.
So verse 11 and 12 has a major indentation in comparison to everything else. So that automatically keys you in. I'm about to read a poem. I'm about to read a poem. After a win or a loss, you just had a baby and you've been barren your entire life, man, I'm going to celebrate. How do biblical authors celebrate? By writing a poem. Man, the whole country just got destroyed. I am sad right now. How do biblical authors express their sorrow? Writing a poem. If you see a defeat, you see a victory, there may be a poem close by. So that's the first part of the skill. Number 2 is read. Reading is self-exclamatory, but remember the context. Remember that when you're reading the poem, make sure you remember what context you read it from for additional help in understanding the poem. And you can often look at the top part of the poem to give you some insight, like the Song of David or the Song of Moses. Automatically, boom, all right, I'm about to engage in a poem. Number 3, explore. So explore the poem, and this is really where the meat of the poem is, because of this skill is. Normally when I used to read poetry, I would read and then get to the next one. But now, from now on, what the habit we want to break through all these practice reps today is to read a poem and go back and explore it. Go back and lift my head off of my tablet and onto the scenery that I'm experiencing right now. How do we explore biblical poetry? We stop and we go back to the beginning. We go back to the beginning and we look for repetition. Do I see any repetitions? Do I see any words coming up twice? Do I see any ideas or thoughts coming up twice? Maybe like God's law, justice. Do I see the word praise come up? So you want to look for figures of speech. In the Bible, you'll see a lot of personifications. Lady Wisdom is a personification. The Lord poured out his spirit. That's a figure of speech. But you want to look for similes. You want to look for metaphors. And you want to look for imagery. And so after you do all that, you want to make sure you leave with the what. Who cares if you get all this exploration, you did all this, and you don't leave with anything. You got to make sure you leave with the what. And all the what is, what was the author trying to, his overarching point. Now, again, there's an overabundance of communication and an overabundance of meaning that you can pull out. Just make sure you pull out the right, at least that right thing, in addition to whatever else you gather. If you need any help trying to figure out what's the what, look at the first and last line of the poem, and that'll generally give you a good idea of what the poet's main point was. And then I want to make sure I say this. Whatever the overabundance of meaning you obtain, it can't deviate from the primary point of what the author wanted to communicate. So I can get all this, I still need to stay in context. The author created a space for you to roam in, Make sure you don't go outside of that space to try to get some type of meaning or something for that. A couple of relevant definitions beside poetry: figure of speech. So a figure of speech is a word or phrase used in a non-literal sense for rhetorical or vivid effect. We use figures of speech all the time. We've used so many, like I fell in love. My head is pounding like a drum. I'm processing this. We're not computers, but we're processing. I mean, it's just like one metaphor after another, one figure of speech after another. So different kinds. So figure of speech is a broad term, but inside of that, we have a simile, which is a figure of speech involving a comparison of one thing with another thing of a different kind, used to make a description more emphatic or vivid. So a simile would be like, he eats like a pig. The like makes it a simile. He eats like a pig. Then you've got a metaphor, which is a figure of speech in which a word or phrase is applied to an object or action to which it's not literally applicable. He is a pig. She is a pig. That's more emphatic and carries different weight. So the like is really what separates them. And this is important because figures of speech are all throughout biblical poetry, and we want to be able to identify them because they help create the journey for us. Figures of speech help us take something concrete and known and map it onto something abstract and hard to explain. Imagery uses vivid descriptions that appeal to a reader's senses to create an image or idea in their head. So when you're looking for imagery in the Bible, this is as the deer panteth for the water, so my soul longeth after thee. The author painted a picture of a deer going through the woods and searching. So you want to capture that image and then explore that image. Two of my favorite metaphors for poetry is poetry is the overpacked suitcase of literary genres. You just keep stuffing as much as you can in there in this tiny little package, and you've got something dense, but it's meaningful. And not only that, poetry is a road trip that you shouldn't ignore. We've all, maybe not we've all, but if you got kids, they've been on those tablets in a road trip and you've been driving, and eventually you have to tell them, y'all look up, because you don't want them to miss a part of the experience. If we treat poetry like it's an essay, we'll just be looking down, just point A to point B, point A to point B. But if we treat poetry like it's what it's meant to be, I'll look up at my surroundings and see something amazing. There's snow-capped mountains out there. There are trees, there are animals, there are people all around me that I just need to look up and take some time to engage in. And so it's going to, because it's an overpacked suitcase, it's going to give us layers of meaning. It's going to give us just, man, that's another sock, that's another shirt, that's another something in this tiny little package.